Thank you. It's wonderful to see a good crowd here at the Tulane Book Festival. And indeed, what a Mardi Gras of the mind this has turned into over the years since it began. My name is Jason Berry. I'm an independent author and writer here in New Orleans, and I'm interviewing Michel, who is an extensively published and widely read authority on foreign affairs. This book is really almost a blueprint about what is happening in Washington as we speak. If you wonder how a government can be gutted and transformed before your eyes, this is the story. Why don't you start by telling us who Ivy Lee was and what Ivy Lee did?
Sure. Thanks so much, Jason. Thanks so much to the entire festival for putting this on. This is my first time at the New Orleans Book Fest, but I certainly don't think it'll be the last.
You're getting a shout out over here. Huh?
Oh, good. Well, that's what, look, it's Friday afternoon. We try to keep things a little loose up here. Has anyone heard of a gentleman named Ivy Lee, for those who haven't read the book? Does anyone know that name at all? So Ivy Lee, if anyone does know him, he's generally remembered as the inventor of the public relations industry. He's the guy who created the PR industry back in the early 20th century. He invented the first press release. He created what was kind of the first crisis playbook management for figures, businessmen, politicians that had some kind of scandal. He helped navigate past those scandals, teach them what to do, how to deflect, how to disarm, and how to message, and how to create the kind of images that these politicians and businessmen wanted and needed. He was wildly successful. He worked with Charles Schwab, he worked with the Rockefellers, he worked with Woodrow Wilson. He really became a celebrity unto himself. And then World War I happened, and then that ended, and he realized there were so many more clients abroad than there were right here in the United States of America. Clients in international contexts, new governments that were emerging, new countries that wanted some friend in Washington to help them navigate the halls of American power, to help sell their story and sell their regimes to Americans and American policymakers. And they were more than happy to pay him so very much money to do that, so much more money than he ever made from the Rockefellers or from Woodrow Wilson. And so he ended up traveling all around the world and going to places like Italy, where a new gentleman named Benito Mussolini had just taken power, and was looking for a friend in Washington. He ended up traveling to Moscow, where a new regime called the Soviet Union was taking root and looking for friends in Washington. And then by the early 1930s, he said, let's do one more, why the heck not? And he traveled to Berlin. Yeah, that's an appropriate reaction. And signed up a new regime called the Nazi Party and had sit-down meetings with Joseph Goebbels, with Adolf Hitler, telling them how to sell their messages, their policies to Americans, to the American government, to help strengthen their grip on power, make sure that no democratic movement ever overthrew them, regardless of what it cost the people on the ground or American policymakers and American interests.
So you're describing basically bloody tyrants, nationalists, fascists, and of course, in Stalin, a mass murderer. And his job, you use a term in this book that really intrigued me. You use the word launder a good deal. Not necessarily in reference to money, although, it's certainly applicable. What did he think as an American of the idea of patriotism?
I can't say that going through his archives,
yeah,
his memos, his letters, his journals, his photos, I can't say I came across a lot of concern about or consideration of patriotism, at least American patriotism. As far as he was concerned, he was perhaps working in American interest, but certainly working in his own interest. He was also under the impression that if he wasn't doing something like this, then perhaps some other American or American firm or American individual would. And they would be getting the business from the Mussolinis, from the Soviets, from the Hitlers. I should say, though, he very clearly had a predilection for strongmen, for dictators. I don't think he thought necessarily highly of democracy or democratic procedures. And my God, the man had an ego. There was a yearbook from his high school, of his high school comrades, making fun of him in the yearbook, writing a fake song that Ivy Lee supposedly wrote about himself, about how great he was. And look, I have a little bit of an ego, but not that much. It was remarkable.
So he was a narcissist before his time.
Yeah, I would say so. And boy, it's been a century, and that still shines through.
Yeah. What was his, well, tell us about how he died.
So 1934, 1935, the Nazis are in power. Hitler is already a dictator. He's well on his way to rearming Germany. The Soviets are, of course, now under the thumb of Stalin, and Mussolini is firmly entrenched in power in Rome. And folks in Washington are realizing that maybe some of these new regimes, certainly there's plenty of concerns about the Soviets, that goes into a whole different political discussion, but some of these other new regimes, these new fascists, which again was a new term, it was a new typology, it was a new phenomenon in the 1930s that Ivy Lee was trying to sell to Americans, but a lot of Americans still had questions about. And by the mid-30s, those questions started to get into Congress, started to trickle upward as folks in Congress were wondering, what exactly do these folks in Rome, and especially in Berlin, what do they actually want? And is it what the American government wants as well? And by the way, this guy, Ivy Lee, we all know him. We've talked to him 1,000 times. We've known him for decades. Why is he suddenly spouting off all this pro-Nazi rhetoric? Why is he saying Hitler's actually a good guy, we should give him a chance, we shouldn't push too hard, and we should also invest in the German economy? Maybe we can bring him aboard. Bring him in for a hearing. And so, in 1935, they have a hearing with Ivy Lee, and they're asking him all of these questions. Mr. Lee, what are you doing? Mr. Lee, why are you saying these things about Hitler? Mr. Lee, who's actually paying you? And Lee says, you don't need to worry about any of that. It's all perfectly fine. It's perfectly good. I'm not being paid by the Nazis. I would never, ever do that in 1,000 years. Now, what actually was happening is it wasn't the Nazis directly paying him. Hitler wasn't sending him a check every month. It was a company, a state-controlled, state-owned conglomerate named IG Farben, which ended up being a key part of the Nazis' the Holocaust and the Second World War. They were the ones paying him. It was a cutout. It was a middleman that was directing all of this money directly into the pockets of Ivy Lee. And as this hearing goes on, these revelations do start spilling out. And Lee was happy to share this to an extent because he thought this would never be public. A few months later, it does become public, and you have these headlines blaring in the New York Times. Ivy Lee outed as Hitler's press agent. And he died almost immediately thereafter. It's difficult to say whether or not, right, there's a gasp right here, that was the cause. Of course, he was under significant stress and strain for 1,000 reasons. But the timing certainly makes it appear that when that information came out, it did kill him.
That's another way of saying he died a broken man.
He absolutely did. His reputation was in tatters. He was outed as a mouthpiece for fascists. And that was his legacy for years and years.
It's something when you consider how popular Viktor Orban is now in some circles of this country.
Yeah.
So legislation arose in response to the infiltration of foreign money. Give us a sense of how that law came to be, because it's a main thread in your book, and how. Give us a sense of how it began and how it evolved.
So a few years shortly thereafter, after Ivy Lee dies, more revelations come out about what the Nazis are doing in the U.S., about what the fascists are doing in the U.S., of course, what the Soviets are also doing in the U.S. Again, this is mid to late 1930s. How they're cultivating Americans, how they're generating American support, how they are messaging, how they are authoring their propaganda, and finding populations in the United States of America that are open to their messaging and open to their actions on the ground. And so they passed something in Congress called the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Has anyone heard of the Foreign Agents Registration Act? It's been in the news a little bit over the last few years, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later.
It's a relatively simple piece of legislation. It doesn't make any of this communication illegal. It doesn't make any of this lobbying that Ivy League have been doing illegal. It simply requires those Americans that are mouthpieces for the Nazis and the Soviets and the fascists in Rome, among plenty other countries, to disclose what they're doing and who they're doing it on behalf of and how much money they are making and how long they have been doing it. They have to disclose that information to the American government, which then discloses that information to the American public. They don't ban any of this. The reason they don't ban any of this is because in the United States Constitution, for as long as we have it for the foreseeable future, there you go.
Well, we're going to let that settle in.
Well, good. And let the murmurs kind of wave through. The First Amendment has a whole series of protections, some of which, again, remain. Freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to assemble. I think folks are generally familiar with those. There's also a fifth one. It's the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, which is just an old-fashioned way of saying you or I, anyone in this audience, has the right to go to a legislator, their local legislator, federal legislator, even the White House itself, and advocate on behalf of whatever cause they hold dear: environmental policy, healthcare policy, arms policy, foreign policy. You have the right to petition that legislator to lobby for a specific policy outcome. This is what makes it so difficult. This is what gets to the root of why this practice has not been banned and why they tried to bring some transparency to this instead.
I want to get you to talk about Paul Manafort, who's sort of the central figure of the book. But first, I'd like it if you would give us a cameo of Bob Dole. I think most of you remember when he ran for president, his famous word, "My word is my bond." And, you know, for those of us out in the hinterlands who follow the news and think we're reasonably well informed, when Bob Dole began advertising Viagra, I just wanted to cheer for him, you know, tottering off the stage after losing to Clinton. But he did something else that really made me sit up that I did not know about until reading your book.
Look, I hate to make light of Viagra commercials.
Well,
while he loses the 96 election.
Right.
Right? He's been in the Senate for years, for decades. He's considered the lion of the Senate. He's certainly still remembered to this day as this kind of, you know, symbol of a more bipartisan era of American politics.
Yeah.
What a lot of folks weren't paying attention to and certainly weren't even concerned by in the late 1990s, early 2000s, after he leaves office. You got to think about the era, right? You know, the Cold War has ended a few years before. It's still the era of American primacy. 9/11 happens, that changes things. But in that time, in that epoch, Bob Dole, he's no longer in office, and he's not just back home in Kansas writing his memoirs. He is signing up as a foreign lobbyist for a whole number of regimes around the world. He's taking his expertise as one of America's leading senators and going to government after government after government and saying, I can be your man in Washington. I can open the doors for you. I can get the policy you want to see passed. I can keep your regime in power. Just pay me what I deserve. Pay me what I want. I don't know what he ended up making. It was some number of millions of dollars along the way.
Made a fortune.
And to his credit, limited as it is, he did sign up some democratic allies of the United States. He worked with Taiwan. He worked with Kosovo. But he also worked with authoritarians and autocrats in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. Most notoriously, he signed up to be the mouthpiece for, the foot soldier for, one of the most notorious Russian oligarchs there is, a guy named Oleg Deripaska, who's really Putin's right-hand man, and was looking for someone in America, in Washington, to get a visa ban lifted on him so he could bring his money into the United States of America, travel throughout the U.S. And this was all before Crimea, all before 2022 and the expanded invasion. This is when people really weren't paying attention to what some of these networks might end up doing, both in the United States of America and elsewhere.
He had a good client in Jonas Savimbi as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay, so maybe some folks, Jonas Savimbi, Angolan warlord, Angola, horrific civil war, 1980s, 1990s. Paul Manafort, and don't to an extent sign up this guy as a client because he's trying to get to Washington to get the arms flowing, get the American support so he can toss out of power those who are the government in Angola. And he's trying to downplay all the concerns and the revelations and the usage of things like, child soldiers and sexual slavery and the most horrific crimes you could possibly think of from the era. And he ends up succeeding. And there's a clip I had to watch for the book where he's up on stage with George H.W. Bush. Oh. And, he's got this, not Bush, I don't think Bush ever wore a beret, but Savimbi's got this beret on, he's got the goatee, he was described as the Che Guevara of the right, and they're just yucking it up there. Meanwhile, again, the crimes this guy is authoring, and it's one of those moments where you kind of feel it in the pit, and you go, well, shit, this isn't great.
And so Bob Dole is the guy who brought him into the fold, so to speak.
So one of the things I think Dole, so it's one thing to talk about these networks and these contracts and these revelations, and I should say the reason that we know about what Bob Dole was doing, the reason we know about what so many of these networks were doing is because of what I mentioned a few moments ago. The Foreign Agents Registration Act has a whole database of all of this information still available on the Department of Justice website. Now, again,
yeah, who knows?
It's 2:15 right now. We'll see where we are by 3 o'clock. But for the time being, it is there. It is freely and legally available. It is an incredible resource. Anyone who's interested in any lobbyist, in any country, in any regime, if you have a computer, can go online and take a look and research for yourself. Look for yourself what they're doing.
Explain just, if you will, how did the documentation work so that you were able, in the book, to show that Savimbi was paying Dole?
So they have the contracts. This is part of the requirements, the disclosures. It's not just who is it, what are you doing, when are you doing it. You have the actual scans of the contract. And again, we'll see where we are for the foreseeable future. But as of right now, all that documentation is there, which is what makes it such an incredible resource. But I wanted to say about Dole, the thing that I think, my sneaking suspicion, my theory is that it was Dole, perhaps more than anyone else, that normalized these practices in Washington. Because speeding up to the present day, there's a headline from Politico that did an analysis of this, and it said, want to be a foreign lobbyist? What's the easiest way to become a foreign lobbyist? Serve in Congress first. Out of the House, out of the Senate, doesn't matter. Out of the White House, certainly doesn't matter.
So we have had passages in American history, the Gilded Age, of course, comes immediately to mind, where the equivalent of, they weren't called oligarchs back then, I don't think. They were called barons. But the corruption, which has been well documented, nevertheless led in many cases to major infrastructure changes that did bring benefit to the country, which is to say, sometimes things can arise regardless of the taint of the money involved. I am really curious, after reading the book, your take on basically the foreign relations establishment. There are so many foundations between New York and Washington that are constantly putting out white papers, holding conferences, the Council on Foreign Relations, among others. And I had no idea the enormous flow of money from these despotic, autocratic, tyrannical regimes that end up in the green pastures of these foundations. This is really the kind of result of the way foreign lobbying corrupted Congress.
It's absolutely the direction things went in, and it's absolutely part of the reason that we ended up where we are today. When we're talking about the lobbying industry, certainly as I write about it in this book, as we kind of understand it here in the 21st century, it's not just traditional lobbying firms. Those certainly exist, those certainly play a role, those certainly have been in Washington and elsewhere for decades and certainly intersect with these networks. We're also talking about public relations firms. We're talking about consultancies. We're talking about law firms. All of them play their own roles, provide their own services, and make significant money from some of those despotic regimes around the world. All of those also have to and do disclose that information in the Foreign Agents Registration Act database. You can go see what they're doing. You can see how they're being paid. You can see what McKinsey is taking from the Saudis. You can see what Skadden Arps is taking from the Ukrainians. You can see go on and go on and go on. There's one industry that has exploded in the past few years, maybe the past few decades at this point, that you were just alluding to, Jason, that does not have to disclose any of this information, that still is completely in the dark. And these are what you were talking about, think tanks. Now, think tanks are these nonpartisan organizations that are nominally dedicated to policy, foreign policy, domestic policy, state-level policy, municipal policy, you name it. Many of them do absolutely wonderful work, including right here in Louisiana. But many of the most prominent ones have also been outed in recent years for taking millions, if not tens of millions of dollars
And dirty money.
From these bloodthirsty, tyrannical regimes, whether it's the Brookings Institution taking tens of millions from Qatar, whether it's the Atlantic Council taking millions of dollars from the United Arab Emirates, whether it's the Council on Foreign Relations having the wealthiest and most prominent Russian oligarch on its board of directors until 2022.
Okay, give a moment for a devil's advocate question. After Katrina, as you know, this city was devastated. It was a broken mud town. There were open questions, even in Congress, about whether the city would exist or should exist. So Qatar, to cite a major example, donated a huge amount of money to Xavier University and got them back on their feet. I believe Qatar also helped Tulane. I don't know if I'm correct on that, but they have helped many universities. So what's your cut on that? I mean, if these are the guys who are helping to corrupt the Brookings Institute, and I'm a guy in a three-piece suit with a, nice golden parachute, and I'm saying to you, come on, son, what's wrong with the money they put down here?
Yeah, well, look, here we are today speaking at an institute of higher education, so I got to be careful what I say. The role of universities, the role of the higher education sector in the United States of America does play a role in this book as well. Universities, again, just to get back to policy things, since the 1980s, have been supposed to disclose, legally required to disclose significant donations, gifts, and contracts from foreign governments and foreign sources. Now, that wasn't enforced for decades until the late 2010s, when there was one investigation of the Department of Education which found among just a dozen or so universities, billions of dollars, $6.5 billion that had not been disclosed. And again, it's not from Canada or Ireland or Mexico or Australia. It's from the Russias and the Chinas and the Saudis and the Qatars of the world. I certainly don't remember Tulane being in there. I'm sure Tulane has turned that down time and again, without a doubt. But the devil's advocate position, of course, is, well, look, okay, fine, it's dirty money. Okay, fine, we don't agree with what these regimes are doing, but you know what? That money's going toward a good cause. You know what? If they're going to send some of their students over here as well, we can instill them with the kind of liberal values that we espouse. We can offer them the opportunities for educational pursuit they would not have otherwise. Oh, by the way, maybe we should actually open up some satellite campuses in Dubai, in Doha, in Abu Dhabi. Wouldn't that be great to spread the values of American education as widely as possible, without realizing that, yes, you are opening the door, but those values are not being spread elsewhere. You are opening the door for those dictatorial regimes and dictatorial values to come in to places like the United States of America.
Very quick cul-de-sac on Doha. I went to Georgetown. We did have electricity when I graduated, but the basketball teams weren't very good. And several years later, Father Timothy Healy, who was the president, famously returned a check, I believe for $750,000 to Iran. This is before the revolution, because of all the reporting on the torture that was being done to political prisoners under the Shah. All to the good. Well, today Georgetown has a campus in Doha. Yeah. So it too is part of this international world where money, I don't know if laundering is the word, but it certainly takes on a fresh, pristine aspect when it reaches the halls of higher
Well,
education. So what
yeah.
do you think about that? If you were in charge, what would you do?
Well, so this is the question, right? A, you're not committing any crime so long as you disclose this information. That's all you have to do. You can accept it. B, this money could go toward a good cause. You open up a new center, you're providing new scholarships, whatever it is. C, now we're talking. You know, if you and I had been talking 3 months ago, 6 months ago, I think we would have been having a different conversation, at least as it pertains to this topic. I don't need to explain to any of you the kind of threats and the kind of actions that have been taken against American universities over just the past 2 weeks.
Right.
That sword of Damocles is hanging over every university here in the United States of America. Funding for Columbia University, funding for any university coming from the federal government is now at risk. And if it does get cut, budgets still have to be met, bills still have to be paid. There is that much more incentive for those universities to go hat in hand to others elsewhere that are willing to foot the bill, whether it's out of Saudi, whether it's out of China, who knows? Maybe even someday the Iranians will come knocking and say, yes, we're happy to have that $750,000 check for you once more. It is an extremely difficult problem to disentangle, and it cuts across the United States of America, and it is something that has no easy solution ahead of it.
That's a good answer.
Thanks. I don't really know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to find my way to a solution,
No.
but haven't gotten there just yet.
I'm old enough to appreciate ambiguity. Let's talk about my college classmate. I never knew him personally, Paul Manafort. I have friends who played baseball with him. And they're all reading your book.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good. Happy opening day to them. Yeah.
So I think many of you are probably aware that Manafort, for a brief period, was Trump's campaign manager in 2016. He later went to prison. I suppose it's fair to say that his violations of the legislation you cite were so egregious that, well, how did he wake up that morning and learn he was in trouble? It's a wonderful picture. Why don't you paint it for us?
So again, you know, the joys of writing a book are you end up doing these little research rabbit holes that you certainly never thought you would do, but when you're in the middle of them, you say, Jesus Christ, when do I get out of this? And one of those was being forced to read Paul Manafort's memoir, which I can't believe I'm saying this at a book festival. Please don't read it. Life is short. But he describes this scene. So this is, I guess, early 2017 at this point. So right, he's Donald Trump's campaign manager. In 2016, he helps launch Trump back to the White House. But there is a scandal out of Ukraine where a new Ukrainian government, they've overthrown the Ukrainian strongman, that the kind of budding dictator that Paul Manafort was working with. And these new Ukrainian Democratic investigators, they uncovered what's called it was a ledger of secret offshore payments going to all manner of people around the world, including the United States, including Paul Manafort. Tens of millions of dollars in off-the-books payments going to the guy who ended up becoming Trump's campaign manager. Now, this spills out into the open. Manafort is forced to resign. Trump still wins the election. But Manafort in 2017 realizes, shit, this isn't going anywhere. And he wakes up one morning, and there are FBI agents at his door. And he puts on his bathrobe, and he shuffles to the door. And he paints this whole scene of them barging in and disrupting his lovely sleep. I'm sure it wasn't quite like that, but then he has to face the music. He ends up convicted. He ends up sentenced. He's 7 years old. He's ended up sentenced to 7-8 years, which is maybe more or less a life imprisonment. He ends up going under house arrest because it was COVID. You couldn't keep him in the prison because he's elderly. And that was really going to be the end of his story. His career had fallen apart. His life had fallen apart. His children are not talking to him. In many ways, it paralleled the end of Ivy Lee's career. Yeah. When this all comes out, it all falls apart. And that's where things were going to go until, I believe it was January 5th, 2021, which the last important thing to happen from Trump's first term. He was pardoned. Sure. Trump says, you're free. Go live your life. You're never going to be relevant again, so who cares? What does it matter? We can wash our hands of this entire sordid saga.
Let's turn the wheel of history backwards. Tell us how he arose, how he put himself into these incredible positions of gaining wealth.
So this is the reason that I chose Ivy Lee, and the reason that I chose Paul Manafort as the kind of two narrative arcs of the book is because what I just mentioned a moment ago. their narrative arcs are so similar. You have Ivy Lee in the early 20th century creating the PR industry and opening doors for both domestic and eventually foreign clients and rising the ranks to become almost a celebrity unto himself. And you have Paul Manafort in the 1970s and 1980s realizing you don't have to be just a political consultant. You don't have to be just a lobbyist. You can do both of those at the same time. You can get people into office, and then you can go to the private sector and say, hey, I have a friend in Congress. Why don't you support them? Why don't you donate them? And then go back to that friend in Congress and say, hey, I have a friend in the private sector who wants to donate to you. Why don't you pass policies that benefit them? And all of a sudden, you see this spiraling outward and outward and outward. And there's a political figure, I can't remember his name. He likes to use the phrase, drain the swamp. And there's a researcher that I cite in this book who says, look, who invented the swamp? It's Paul Manafort. And then by the 1990s, by the 2000s, now he is working around the world, no longer just in the United States of America. He's going to Somalia, he's going to Angola, he's going to Nigeria, he's going to the Philippines, and he's going to Ukraine and working with a guy named Viktor Yanukovych, who was thrown out of power in 2014. The rest is history. Wow, yeah, nice. That's right, yeah. No, oh, I should say, he's making tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. He has horrible taste. He has, just like the guy, he has an ostrich skin jacket. He has, gilded this and golden that, right? These guys have just such terrible taste. Not as bad as Yanukovych, though, who had not only a literal golden loaf of bread, but also a nude portrait of himself. Again, these are the research rabbit holes I trained my whole life for.
So, given this background, which is darkly fascinating, what is the connective tissue with what Trump is trying to do in Ukraine now?
There's a whole story. There's another book to be written.
Right.
I don't want to do it. Someone to trace.
This is Cliff Notes.
This is the Cliff Notes version, right? What Trump is trying to do in Ukraine, it goes back to the whole history of Russian domination of Ukraine, Ukrainians fight for independence, going all the way back to Tsarist times, to the Soviet period, now to modern days, and this kind of intersection with and inflection with American policy. Go back to I can totally nerd out on all this stuff right now. But the long story short is Trump, similar to Putin, does not view Ukraine or Ukrainians as a sovereign entity, as a sovereign nation, worthy of independence, certainly not worthy of any kind of alliance or support for democratic forces therein. Much of that comes from whether it's Russian propaganda outlets or conversations with Putin directly, but much of that also comes from figures like Paul Manafort, who was the very first person, as I report in the book, to put this idea in Trump's ear that, oh no, it wasn't the Russians who interfered in the 2016 election. Boy, it was actually the Ukrainians. What are the odds? That is when the animus toward Ukraine first began for Trump. Because again, he believes all of these incredibly stupid conspiracies, and yet, of course, he's in a
You only
significant
have
position of power.
one footnote to Hunter Biden in the book.
I did.
How does Hunter Biden and the fabled laptop fit into this whole bizarre topography of power?
Hunter Biden is an example of how family members of American politicians take significant advantage of, yes, the access, but even more than anything, just the last name. If we think of some of these, the policy science term is patronalism, right? If you think of some of these authoritarian regimes where it's who knows who is related to who, right? Who is the sultan's nephew, who is the emir's uncle, who is the dictator's daughter. That's how many of these regimes operate, and that's how they recognize manners of operation in the United States of America. To an extent, they're right. Certainly to a greater extent with the Trump family than maybe ever before, they're right. But this is what Hunter Biden was playing on, whether he was working in China or Romania or Ukraine as well. He had no expertise in the gas industry, but he knew exactly why he was making tens of millions of dollars from a Ukrainian oligarch who is as crooked as they come, and that was to open doors and access right there in Washington. Now, I should say the earliest instance that I found of this, does anyone remember Billy Carter?
Yeah.
All right, there's some laughter. All right, so Billy Beer, right? That was what he was known for. Turns out he was up to a few other things than creating just his own beer while he was brother of President Jimmy Carter. He was lobbying for, of all people, Gaddafi in Libya.
I remember
I don't remember this. a whole scandal at the time where Jimmy Carter had to disavow his brother, say, oh my God, I would never in 1,000 years ever consider opening my doors to my dear brother Billy. And it's funny how history can rhyme. That's all. I've never had Billy Beer. I don't know if it's any good.
So Hunter Biden then just becomes a convenient wedge.
Well, he becomes a convenient wedge. He's a wedge of his own making. No one ever forced him to do any of this.
No, but I mean for Trump and this whole idea about Ukraine and the issue that he kept driving. I mean, your coverage of all of these interconnected networks of money, of corruption, and the whole laundering process, if you will, of legitimacy that Congress is now pretty much on board with. It makes one wonder, especially with the slashing of the federal government that's underway, how it would be possible to ever rebuild a republic of laws, of legal legitimacy.
I think that's a little above my pay grade. But you're exactly right. Look, if there's a silver lining to what Trump has been doing over the past month, the past 2 months, in terms of funding cuts, in terms of dismantling rule of law, in terms of the weaponization of things like the Justice Department, if there's a silver lining in what he's doing, it's that he is not relying on the congressional process. He's not relying on the legislative process to repeal some of the bills, some of the acts that he and his allies are opposed to. He's simply using his executive order powers to say, I'm not going to enforce this, I'm not going to fund that, I'm going to target these people, I'm going to sanction them. Obviously, much of that is horrific. There's a whole laundry list of bills that we could talk about that we don't need to go into. Right. It's been the worst 2 months for American anti-corruption, counter-kleptocracy policy ever, which is, again, it's not great. But the silver lining is, a future administration, should we get there at some point, could theoretically use the power of the pen and say, no, I will enforce America's primary anti-bribery statutes. I will reinstate the Department of Justice task forces that were supposed to go after oligarchs and kleptocrats. I will enforce the basic underpinnings of American pro-transparency, counter-kleptocracy policy. Now, look, restoring the rule of law, restoring trust in the federal government, that is a generations-long task. This is what I will be talking about with my grandchildren someday, should we get there. But it just certainly has to start somewhere.
I want to ask you about Christian nationalism, and I realize it is not a major theme of your book, but it's kind of it's almost like a shadow. When you think of how the Soviet Union and later the emergence of Russia, how all of that was portrayed to Christian believers, not just evangelicals, as recently as 20 years ago, the support that Trump has drawn from so many of these evangelical pastors and leaders. Do you have a way of not so much explaining, but rationalizing how a religious belief system that for so much of our lives and for decades before that it had a focus on tyranny and injustice? I mean, regardless of how one interprets the Gospels, or for that matter, the Old Testament, the idea of injustice and tyranny is just an embedded theme through Old and New Testament. We're going through such a revolution right now in that regard. Give me your cut on that.
Well, before I do, I wanted to just pause, because I know we have about 5 minutes or so left, because I want to turn the tables just for a second. Yeah, sure. Does everyone know who Jason is?
Oh, come on.
Is everyone familiar with it? All right, we got some applause. Thank you. For those... Just as a quick little biography, those who don't know, Jason is one of the leading journalists, one of the most prominent and successful, kind of awe-inspiring almost in a way, without getting blowing too much smoke. Investigative journalists, certainly here in Louisiana, but around America, around America as well.
Thank you.
He has written, 11, 12 books now. Some of them include Lead Us Not into Temptation, 1992, Vows of Silence, 2004, Render Unto Rome, 2011, all leading investigations of the sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, financial corruption and chicanery out of the Catholic Church as well. Now, what's the most recent one?
City of a Million Dreams.
That has nothing to do with Catholic sex abuse or corruption.
No. It's all about the holy city where jazz began.
So the reason that I mention that is not just to make sure that everyone knows who Jason is and why it's such an honor to join him up here today. I will say Jason also won, I don't remember which award it was, for covering David Duke. And
Alicia
the reason
Patterson,
that I mention that is because David Duke spent a good bit of time in Moscow in the 1990s.
Yeah.
His book was sold in the Russian parliament. There's a photo of him right in his Moscow apartment. It is still to this day, 30 years later, unclear what David Duke was doing there, who he was meeting with,
or how he got his money,
how he got there, how long it lasted, let alone the kind of legacies and connections. So the reason that I mention that is not only to make sure everyone knows who Jason is, but also to highlight the fact that these linkages, these networks did not begin last year. They did not begin last 5 years. They didn't even begin in the last 10 years. These go back decades. And you see the emergence of a post-Soviet Russia and the flip in the understanding of the recognition of what had been a totalitarian, atheistic empire of the Soviet Union.
Right.
That, of course, every Christian nationalist, frankly, every Christian of any kind of stripe, is going to oppose. That comes tumbling down, and what you see emerge is a brand new Russian nationalistic, imperialistic, autocratic, and increasingly dictatorial regime that is highlighting, that is playing up, and that is relying on the support of those Christian nationalists in the United States and abroad, because that is the core identity that they are bringing to bear.
By the way, that was a very elegant answer. No, I want to give you a little footnote, though, on David Duke. A lot of people don't realize this. The Soviet Empire falls in 1989, the year that he is narrowly elected to the Louisiana legislature. 2 years later, the governor's race against Edwin Edwards, which the late John McGinnis called the race from hell. And vote for the crook, it's important. Thank you, sir. So if you think about this, Edwards demolished him 61 to 39%. But within that 39%, David Duke got the vast majority of white voters. I think it was something like 64%. And he got strong support from evangelical Christians. And I remember interviewing one of the pastors, a guy named Neil Curran, who actually started in New Orleans, is now in Dallas, and he held a meeting with several of these Christian pastors to try to persuade them to tell their flocks that voting for Duke is voting for someone who has promoted Holocaust denial, and you go right down the checklist. I think that race was a precursor of so much of what we have seen since then with the legitimization of white supremacy right under our nostrils and growing as it is today.
Well, one of the speakers on stage yesterday, Adam Serwer of The Atlantic, actually had a great article a couple years ago making that exact same argument.
Well, he's a smart man.
Oh, absolutely is. But again, this gets back to the things that we were not paying attention to, that we didn't have any concern about, that we thought would never pay off in anything that ever opposed our interests.
Okay, so here's my question. In all of the extensive research you've done, have you found any financial trails that lead from Russia or Ukraine to Christian front groups?
Well, that's a great question. One of the groups I didn't write about in this book, but I have covered in the past, is called the World Congress of Families. I don't have a minute, so I'll just do a quick little spiel.
Wow. Okay.
This is the leading Russian-American far-right evangelical association. It's based out of the States, but has received funding from a number of Russian oligarchs, including some who are now sanctioned. I was at their conference in Moldova a few years ago. It was one of the strangest things I've ever done. They had like dancing babies up on the screen, and then we all got drunk in a wine cellar. And it was extremely strange. But the reason I say that is because, yes, these linkages are there. They have been there. They began back in the 1990s when no one was paying any attention, and they continue to this day.
Casey, I want to thank you for the courage it takes to do this kind of work. This is a hell of a book.
Well, that goes likewise, Jason.
Well,
Thank you.
so we are winding down with, unfortunately, the rule this year is that we're not allowed to ask questions, take questions. And so we have come to the end of our time, and thank you so much, sir.
Thanks, Jason.
And
Thanks,
you all.
everyone.